Hello, this is Mr. Langhorst. We are going to continue talking about Unit 2 today in the title of Colonial Resistance Grows. Now, we started talking about some of the taxes. Today, we're going to continue on with that and talk about a couple of events that begin to kind of turn the tide towards revolution in the colonies. So, when we left off, we talked about how they just repealed the Stamp Act. Then the British come back and they issue something called the Townsend Acts. Now, New York was being a little bit stubborn about housing British troops. So one thing that the Townsend Acts does is it says that they're going to suspend New York's assembly until they give in and start to house British troops. And then they also begin to tax various other goods that are brought into the colonies. Now, this is happening in 1767. The other things that are going to be taxed in the Townsend Acts are paper, paint, lead, glass, and tea. So, of course, probably most famously the tea there, which we're going to talk about in just a little bit. Now, another thing that begins to rub the colonists the wrong way is something called the writs of assistance. Now, this is kind of like a search warrant, but today if you get a search warrant, it has to be issued by a judge, there has to be probable cause. The British began using this thing called writs of assistance, and it allowed the British officers to go into homes and to look for smuggled goods. So essentially they say, well, we want to find out if you're paying taxes on the goods you have and whether or not you're legit. But in reality, in many cases, it's just kind of an excuse to go into a home, possibly steal something, kind of spy on the people, and it's just kind of another one of those annoyances that the British have on the colonists. So the colonists are upset. They thought the Townsend Acts were illegal. This is yet another tax passed without the colonists having a say in it. And they're beginning to believe that all of these things are going against something called their natural rights as humans. That they feel that there's really no way they should be taxed like this, especially when they don't have representation in Parliament. Another group, in addition to the Sons of Liberty, are the Daughters of Liberty. This is a female protest group that begins to grow in the colonies. And they urge colonists to do things like weave their own cloth so they don't have to pay taxes on goods that are coming in and being taxed. They encourage people to use American-made products, and they begin to really spread the support of the boycotts on the items that are taxed by the British. So just another example of how the colonists are beginning to get organized in their working against the British. Another example is the Committees of Correspondence. These are committees or groups of people that begin to exchange secret letters and information between especially towns. So like outside of Boston, there's kind of this kind of web of little towns surrounding Boston. A lot of these towns have a little organization that kind of talks about how many guns they have for like a local militia, what they might do against boycotts, and they begin to talk to each other. So committees of correspondence are kind of like these groups of people that are sharing information, typically made up of people that are anti-British taxes and all these annoyances that are happening by the British. So they communicate by basically having meetings, by sharing information. This is going to become important later as we begin to talk about what happens in Lexington and people beginning to share information about British troop movements and things like that. All right, so that's going to lead us to one of the events that we're going to talk about today or focus on today, and that's the Boston Massacre. Now, we're going to talk about this in a lot of detail. This is just going to be the very shortened version. But this happens on March 5th, 1770. We're going to talk about what the colonists said happened and what the British said happened. But basically, the colonists surround some British soldiers that are guarding the customs house in Boston. And it's a snowy night. There's a lot of taunting going on by the Patriots. They're calling the British soldiers things like lobsterbacks and things like that. And eventually it becomes kind of this mob scene. There's snowballs being thrown. There's people that have clubs in their hand, possibly threatening the British soldiers. And for whatever reason, one of the British soldiers panic, and the soldiers fire into the crowd. 5 people are killed, including Crispus Attucks, who's an African American. And this becomes an example of the British being overbearing towards the colonists. Now, whether it really happened that way, we're going to talk about that a lot in class here. We're going to examine this particular engraving. It's actually an engraving. They add color to it, so it kind of looks like a painting here. But this is Paul Revere's engraving. Now, you got to remember, Paul Revere is very anti-British. He is one of the Sons of Liberty. He makes this engraving to make it look like the British are firing into a defenseless group of American colonists in Boston. And we're going to really analyze this picture in class and talk about all the inaccuracies. But this is printed, and this is what many colonists see as what happened at the Boston Massacre. Here's another example of it. You can tell if I go back and forth here, the colors are a little bit different. We'll talk about the engraving process and how that works a little bit later in an activity. This is a painting probably more realistic to what really happened. The British soldiers are not firing into a defenseless crowd. The American colonists there have clubs in their hand, and they're a little bit more aggressive. They're kind of more in their face. It's more nighttime, things like that. So this is probably a more realistic example of what really happened at the Boston Massacre. But the most important thing is there's 5 colonists that are now dead, and the British are being blamed for their deaths. Here's a picture of the site of the Boston Massacre. It's kind of a cool place there, kind of in downtown Boston, and you got the old customs house there in the middle. And if you go there today, they've kind of made an area where they kind of believe that the Boston Massacre happened. If you look here, they have a circle with bricks, and then it says the Boston Massacre and the date and everything on the outer edge of that. So there is a court case. These British soldiers are being tried with murder of killing these colonists. And John Adams, a colonist, actually someone that supports the Sons of Liberty, decides that he is going to defend the soldiers in court. So Adams stands up and he says, you know, we want to prove that in the colonies you're not guilty until you're proven guilty. You're innocent until proven guilty. And so Adams stands up and supports the British soldiers in court. And there's a lot of different dynamics to this case that we'll talk about. But the end result is that John Adams really wants to show that everybody is subject to the rule of law in the colonies. Now, of course, John Adams does become a future president of the United States. He's actually the second president, follows George Washington. And the outcome of the trial is that the jury agrees with Adams that the soldiers were acting in self-defense, and they are acquitted of the charges. So they're not going to be executed for murder as a result of what happened at the Boston Massacre. Now, there's a lot of details here. The jury was very kind of like highly selected by Adams, and there were a lot of people that kind of supported the British and stuff. But the big picture is that the trial shows that people can get a fair case in America, and the British soldiers are not found guilty of murder in this particular case. Now let's go back to one of the taxes. This is probably the more famous of the taxes that we're going to talk about here, and that's the tea tax. So eventually the Townsend Acts are also repealed, just like the Stamp Act was. But the British continue to have a tax on tea, partially to show that they still have the power to rule the colonies and tax. There's also a lot of kind of economic forces here. Tea is a very important thing for the colonists to have, and there's one particular company that the British government is trying to save. And in essence, what they're doing is they're taxing the tea, but in reality, they're really lowering the price for the colonists. But the colonists aren't going to stand for this. Even though the tea is going to cost less, they still are against the principle of having this tax placed upon them. So on December 16th, 1773, a group of men organized by the Sons of Liberty disguised themselves as Native Americans. They board several ships in Boston Harbor, and they dump tea off into the harbor. Over 300 chests, something like 92,000 pounds of tea are destroyed. They're very careful not to harm anybody. They don't do anything to the ships. They just want to destroy the tea as an act of, we're not going to take this anymore. Today, the value of that tea would be somewhere around like $1.7 million. So it's a lot of tea. The British are outraged. They can't believe the colonists would go this far and destroy that much tea. And they demand that there's going to be more taxes, and there's going to be punishments, and that the colonists are going to have to pay for this tea. So we will pick the story up on our next section of notes and find out what the British do after the Boston Tea Party. But to this point, I want you to understand the Boston Tea Party, the Boston Massacre, and the Townsend Acts. All right, we'll pick it up in the next set of notes. Thanks.